organisms in the human body. Today, we are exploring the absolute intricacies of the human respiratory system. From the very first breath of air you draw in, down to the microscopic structures hidden deep within your chest, we're going to break down exactly how this magnificent system keeps you alive, and, crucially, what happens when it goes wrong. But before we get bogged down in the complex anatomy, I want you to ground this in your everyday physical reality. Try something real quick. Just place your hand over your chest and take a deep breath right now. You feel that? Our chest continuously expands and shrinks day and night without us even having to think about it. But what exactly is happening in there when we take that deep breath? What invisible physical processes are swelling and shrinking right underneath your ribcage? Let's start from the top. Section 1, the path of breath. So our body's very first line of defense actually begins with inhalation through the nostril and into the nasal cavity. This is a triangular-shaped space sitting just above the buccal cavity, your mouth. Now, inside this space, the interior part is completely covered with tiny hairs and a membrane, and there's a really good reason for that. The air around us isn't perfectly clean, right? It's full of dust and germs, so these hairs and membranes work together to actively obstruct and filter out those harmful particles, protecting all the delicate tissues further down. From the nasal cavity, the air passes through the nasopharynx and arrives at a totally critical junction, the larynx. If you notice, it sits right at the junction of the pharynx and the trachea. Now, while it does house your vocal cords for sound, its absolute most crucial role for a patient's immediate health is actually acting as a vital protective lid. When you're eating, this lid immediately covers the larynx hole so that food simply cannot enter the airway. And then, it brilliantly opens back up again only during inhalation. It's basically a built-in safety valve. Understanding this continuous chain of command is so important. Let's map it out clearly. The air enters the nostril, moves through the nasopharynx, passes safely through the larynx, and then travels down the trachea. From there, it branches off into the bronchus, dividing further and further until it reaches the microscopic alveoli. This flowchart right here represents the entire highway of oxygen, moving from the open atmosphere all the way down into the deepest, most hidden parts of your lungs. All right, let's follow that path further down. Section 2, deep inside the lungs. Right in the center sits the trachea. You can think of it as the essential main highway for air. Through this one tube, all of your life-sustaining oxygen enters. And as it gets near the lungs, notice how this main highway divides beautifully into two distinct paths, the right and left bronchus, which then plunge directly into the right and left lungs, respectively. Situated on both sides of the heart, the lungs themselves are actually surprisingly soft. They have a texture very much like a sponge. But notice the layers surrounding them. The lungs are covered by two fold membranes known as the pleura. Now, because your lungs are constantly inflating and deflating right next to the hard bones of your ribcage, they absolutely need protection. So in between these pleurofolds is a slimy substance that completely prevents any dangerous friction against the chest wall. It's an incredibly smart design. Now, as those bronchus tubes enter the lungs, they divide into innumerable branches and subbranches, called bronchioles, finally ending in microscopic air cells. We call these the alveoli, or air sacs. They're made of incredibly thin epithelial cells and are entirely surrounded by tiny capillary vessels. Their specific role is critical. When air enters these cells, they literally swell up just like a tiny balloon and then shrink automatically. Because the walls are so incredibly thin, oxygen passes easily into the blood and carbon dioxide passes back in to be exhaled. Which brings us to the forces driving this whole process. Section 3, the mechanics of breathing. Consider an everyday task for a second. If you were to stand up right now and just run around the room for a few minutes, what would happen? Well, your breathing rate would immediately jump higher than it is in your resting state. Why is that? Because the process of external respiration, where that gaseous exchange happens between the lungs and capillary vessels, has to drastically increase. Your active body demands more energy, which simply means it demands more oxygen to oxidize cellular food. So, what's the incredible muscle powering all of this? It sits right at the bottom of the chest cavity, the diaphragm. As the source material wonderfully describes it, it looks like an open umbrella. The diaphragm is a muscular layer that physically separates your abdominal cavity from your chest cavity, and its expansion and contraction is the fundamental driver of every single breath you take. Let's actually contrast the physical mechanics here. During inhalation, the muscles of the diaphragm shrink and actually move downwards. This causes the area of the chest cavity to increase, basically pulling oxygenated air right in. During exhalation, the exact opposite occurs. The diaphragm and chest cavity muscles relax and squeeze upwards.
As a result, the area of the lungs becomes small, acting just like a bellows to push the air and carbon dioxide right back out through the nostril.
All right, moving on to section 4, healthy versus damaged lungs. So we've seen how perfectly this system operates under normal, healthy conditions. But what happens when things go wrong? Let's pivot our clinical lesson to pathology to see what happens when this delicate system gets compromised by disease. Here we've laid out 4 common diseases of the respiratory tract to contrast healthy lung function against these damages. First up, tuberculosis. This is a highly infectious disease caused by a specific bacteria, leading to gradual weight loss and a cough with bleeding. Then there's pneumonia, which often hits children after a cold or measles. It's also a bacterial infection causing severe breathing difficulties and high fever. Bronchitis is a viral infection that directly attacks the trachea. And finally, we have asthma, which, unlike the others, isn't an infectious or contagious disease. Instead, it's triggered by things like dust, food, or pollen, causing sudden and very severe breathing trouble.
Looking a bit closer at the pathological impacts, we see that diseases like bronchitis specifically cause a viral tracheal infection. That means your main highway is inflamed, leading to respiratory trouble and a real weakening of the patient. Asthma, on the other hand, attacks the deepest, most delicate part of the system. During an asthma attack, the fragile alveoli of the lung do not get a proper supply of oxygen, or the supply gets entirely blocked. The patient tries to breathe forcibly, and you can even see the skin between the ribs visibly pushed in. Those balloon-like alveoli simply cannot inflate.
Now, as student doctors, you also absolutely need to know the interventions. To protect and treat the respiratory tract, our sources highlight several key preventative measures and remedies. For tuberculosis, the BCG vaccine is given to newborns as a primary defense. Across the board, providing nutritious food is absolutely essential for recovery. Furthermore, patients with respiratory issues like asthma must live in well-ventilated, well-lit houses, absolutely avoid dust, and giving up the habit of smoking is completely mandatory to prevent any further damage to the tracheal cilia and alveoli.
We've traveled a long way today, from the protective hairs in the nostril, down that main tracheal highway, and straight into the microscopic, balloon-like alveoli that swap gases just to keep your cells alive. But we've also seen how easily this incredible system can be devastated by bacteria, viruses, and smoke. So I want to leave you with this final thought. If our alveoli are truly as fragile as tiny balloons, what steps will you take today to protect your own respiratory highway?